that all support a lab leak as a source and can go deeper into each of those with questions. First, the virus was spreading in Wuhan and around the world in the fall of 2019, months before the first case in the Hunan seafood market. This is supported by 14 observations or evidence. The evidence includes the calculation of the time to the most recent common ancestor, hospital overloads in Wuhan, antibodies in patients from Italy, Spain, and the US, wastewater samples from Brazil, sick athletes at the October Wuhan military games, school closings in Wuhan, and dozens of documented patients. This dismisses out of hand the market as the origin. But second, let's look at the market data. The human infections, the animal samples, and the environmental specimens. These generate 8 observations. No infected animals in the market or the supply chain were infected. No infected wildlife vendors had SARS. All human infections are the non-ancestral lineage B. The environmental specimens with animal DNA have no SARS-2. One vendor had animals from southern China where SARS-2 came from, but this vendor and his animals are negative for SARS-2. Now, only one of 14 environmental samples with raccoon dog DNA contains SARS reads, and that contains 1 read out of 210 million. 13 of the 14 raccoon dog DNA specimens had no SARS-2. With SARS-1, literally 100% of the market animals were infected. I frankly think it is shameful for scientists to mislead journalists and the public saying these data I just described are evidence raccoon dogs were infected with SARS-2. This is why trust in science is broken. None of these data are consistent with an infected animal passing SARS-2 to a human at the market. The 1,500-kilometer distance to the nearest SARS-2-related virus is like the distance from Washington, D.C. to the Florida Everglades. Imagine you're at dinner at a restaurant in North Bethesda near the NIAID labs. You get sick, and you are told that the virus you caught is only found in bats from the Everglades, but it also happens to be under study at the laboratories you see outside the restaurant window. That's what the market origin people are asking you to believe. Third, documented events at or related to Wuhan Institute of Virology beginning in March 2019 are consistent with the expected activities when a lab-acquired infection has occurred. This timelines include unusual attention from the Chinese Communist Party, leading to the PLA physician soldier being put in charge. Large tender requests to repair biosafety equipment, a virus database disappearing in the middle of the night, large tender requests for a lab security force to, quote, handle foreign personnel, end quote, patents for a device to prevent a lab-acquired infection, rumors in the virology community of a new SARS virus in the lab, 30 vials of the 3 most dangerous viruses on the planet being shipped illegally from a lab in Canada to WIV in March, and then one of those pathogens being found as a major contaminant in a BLC lab in December. These events taken together are a classic example of closing the barn door after the horse has left. Fourth, the evidence that is found in a natural zoonosis with respect to the animal host, the virus, and the human are missing with COVID. 96,000 animals were tested and are negative for SARS-2. 43,000 blood samples from blood donors in Wuhan were tested. A natural spillover like SARS-1 would have produced about 260 positives. A lab accident would be 0, and of course, 0 is what is found. With respect to the virus, a spillover produces posterior diversity in the virus genome. A lab leak does not. SARS-2 has no posterior diversity. Natural spillovers, as Dr. Gary indicated this morning, involve multiple markets. SARS-1 began in southern China, had 11 spillovers in 11 different markets in 9 different cities. Christian Anderson, the proximal origin in SARS-2, said SARS-2 was one person being infected with one animal. I agree. Fifth, the genome of SARS-2 has 8 features found in a synthetic virus that are not found in natural viruses. The probability that SARS-2 came from nature based on these features is 1 in a billion. These features are the backbone, the receptor binding domain, the furin cleavage site, the genetics of the furin cleavage site, the number, location, and pattern of cloning sites in SARS-2 that use the Barrick cloning method, and the ORF8 gene. Based on SARS-2 cloning sites, I predicted how SARS-2 could be made in the laboratory. A year later, Barrick used the predicted steps to make an infectious clone of SARS-2. These same features were described in a 2018 DARPA grant by WIV and U.S. scientists. With respect to the grant, SARS-2 had the proposed backbone from the proposed region in China, the proposed adaptation to human killing, the proposed diversity from SARS-1, the proposed no-seum cleavage site number, location, and pattern, the proposed human cleavage site at the proposed S1-S2 junction. Let's close with a thought experiment. It's 2018. Do you think a market spillover of a coronavirus could have happened in Wuhan? Dr. Daszak and Shi have studied coronaviruses for a decade, and they said no. How do I know that? Because they used Wuhan residents as control for a study looking for antibodies in coronaviruses in people living near bat caves in southern China. The rural residents had a 3% rate. Wuhan residents had 0. Let's flip that and ask the reverse question. Do you think a lab-acquired infection could begin in Wuhan, a city with the world's leading laboratory collecting coronavirus from nature, doing synthetic biology on coronaviruses, doing petri dish and animal research on coronavirus, with a bat colony for testing, and that had written a blueprint to make a coronavirus that had 7 unique features found in SARS-CoV-2? I'll let you answer that question yourself. I have a number of specific reforms I believe should be implemented, and I would be happy to discuss them during the questioning. What happens if we have these hearings and nothing happens? The Wuhan Institute of Virology right now is testing a Nipah virus in a synthetic clone. This is a U.S. CDC bioterrorism agent. It kills 3 out of 4 people. A lab leak with an airborne Nipah virus would quickly, within weeks, disrupt food and energy distribution, fire and police services, medical care. My analysis of this tipping point event is that it would set back civilization about 250 years. The work of this committee is critical. If we now fail to act with the knowledge we have, history, if it can still be recorded, will judge us poorly. Thank you for your time.
Governors, thank you. Professor of Chemistry and Chemical Biology at Rutgers University. He also serves as the Laboratory Director for the Waxman Institute of Microbiology, a position he has held for 37 years. Dr. Ebright has authored over 185 peer-reviewed publications and holds more than 45 issued and pending U.S. patents. He's the co-founder of Biosafety Now and a member of the advisory board of the Global Biolabs Project and the Institutional Biosafety Committee at Rutgers University. Previously, he served on the Antimicrobial Resistance Committee for Infectious Disease Society of America, the Controlling Dangerous Pathogens Project, and the Pathogen Security Working Group for the state of New Jersey. Dr. Ebright, welcome to the committee. You are now recognized for your opening statement.
Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to discuss the origins of COVID-19. I'm Board of Governors Professor of Chemistry and Chemical Biology at Rutgers University and Laboratory Director at the Waxman Institute of Microbiology. In my statement, I will present my assessment of the origin of COVID and will summarize key lines of evidence that support my assessment. I assess that a large preponderance of evidence indicates SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID, entered humans through a research incident. I base this assessment on information in publicly available documents, press reports, and scientific papers, on my research experience in microbial genomics, microbial genetics, DNA synthesis technology, and recombinant DNA technology, and on my knowledge of and experience with biosafety, biosecurity, and biorisk management for work with pathogens. 4 key facts support my assessment. First, COVID emerged in Wuhan, a city that is 800 miles from the closest bats harboring SARS-CoV-2-like viruses that could have served as progenitors of SARS-CoV-2, but that contains labs that prior to the outbreak were conducting the world's largest research program on bat SARS viruses, possessed the world's largest collection of bat SARS viruses, and possessed the virus most closely similar to SARS-CoV-2. The large distance between Wuhan and bats harboring SARS-CoV-2-like viruses points away from a natural origin of COVID, and Wuhan's status as the global epicenter of research on bat SARS viruses points toward a research origin of COVID. Second, in the 4 years preceding the outbreak, Wuhan labs performed research that placed them on a trajectory to obtain SARS viruses having high pandemic potential. And in 2018, 1 year before the outbreak, Wuhan labs proposed research to obtain SARS viruses having even higher pandemic potential and features that match in detail the features of SARS-CoV-2. Wuhan Labs performed high-risk virus discovery and gain-of-function research on bat SARS viruses. In their virus discovery research, Wuhan researchers searched for new bat viruses in caves in southern China, brought samples to Wuhan, and sequenced, cultured, and characterized new viruses in Wuhan. In their gain-of-function research, Wuhan researchers genetically modified bat SARS viruses, constructing viruses having enhanced ability to infect human cells and having enhanced viral growth and enhanced lethality in mice engineered to possess human receptors for SARS viruses, so-called humanized mice. Already in 2015, scientists expressed concern that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was conducting research that posed unacceptably high risk. At a 2015 Royal Society and National Academies meeting on gain-of-function research and its oversight, the research on bat SARS viruses by the Wuhan Institute of Virology and its collaborators was singled out as the research most likely of all research in the world to trigger a pandemic. In 2017 to 2018, with NIH funding, the Wuhan Institute of Virology constructed genetically modified SARS viruses that combined the spike gene from one bat SARS virus with the rest of the genetic information from another bat SARS virus, obtaining new viruses that efficiently infected human cells and obtaining at least one new virus that exhibited 10,000 times enhanced viral growth in lungs and 1 million times enhanced viral growth in brains and 3 times enhanced lethality in humanized mice. In 2018, just 1 year before the outbreak, in an NIH grant proposal, the Wuhan Institute of Virology and collaborators proposed to construct additional genetically modified SARS viruses, proposing to construct viruses having spikes with even higher binding affinities for human SARS receptors, seeking viruses having even higher pandemic potential. Also in 2018, just 1 year before the outbreak, in a DARPA grant proposal, the Wuhan Institute of Virology and its collaborators proposed to construct genetically modified SARS viruses having a furin cleavage site, a feature associated with increased viral growth and increased transmissibility. They proposed to insert the furin cleavage site at the spike gene S1, S2 border and to construct the viruses by synthesizing 6 nucleic acid building blocks and assembling them using the reagent BSM-B1. Third, Wuhan Labs performed this research on SARS viruses using an inadequate biosafety standard, just biosafety level 2, an inadequate personal protective equipment, just gloves and a lab coat. Lab accidents that result in infection or release are common, even at biosafety levels higher than biosafety level 2. For context, the original SARS virus, SARS-CoV-1, caused lab-acquired infections in Singapore at biosafety level 3, in Beijing twice at biosafety level 3, and in Taipei at biosafety level 4. For further context, SARS-CoV-2 itself caused lab-acquired infections in Beijing in 2020 at biosafety level 3, and in Taipei in 2021 at biosafety level 3. The Wuhan Lab's use of biosafety level 2 for research on bat SARS viruses would have posed a high risk, a very high risk, of infection of lab staff upon encountering a virus having the aerosol transmission properties of SARS-CoV-2. Fourth, in 2019, a novel SARS virus having a spike with extremely high binding affinity for human SARS receptors, a furin cleavage site inserted at the spike S1, S2 border, and a genome sequence with features enabling assembly from 6 synthetic nucleic acid building blocks using the reagent BSM-B1, a virus having the exact features proposed in the 2018 NIH and DARPA proposals, emerged on the doorstep of Wuhan Institute of Virology. SARS-CoV-2 is the only one of more than 800 known SARS viruses that possesses a furin cleavage site. Mathematically, this observation alone implies that the probability of finding a natural SARS virus possessing a furin cleavage site is less than 1 in 800. Taken together, the presence of a spike having an extremely high affinity for human SARS receptors, the presence of a furin cleavage site inserted at the spike S1, S2 border, the genome sequence enabling assembly from 6 synthetic nucleic acid building blocks using the reagent BSM-B1, and the 1-4-1 match between these features and the features proposed in the 2018 NIH and DARPA proposals make an extremely strong case, a smoking gun, for a research origin. In summary, multiple lines of secure evidence point to a research origin. By contrast, as I hope I will have the opportunity to review in response to questions, no, zero secure evidence points toward a natural origin. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to each of our witnesses. Dr. Gary, my first question is I'm going to direct it towards you. Of the evidence that's been presented thus far, it's still not clear to me how much is concrete, documented information, and how much is speculation, or perhaps just filling in the gaps with assumptions based on what's out there. So my question for you, Dr. Gary, is could you elaborate more on the specific hard evidence that supports your claim that the Chinese market in Wuhan was the most likely source of the virus?
Certainly, and thank you for the question. There is a lot of evidence that this virus emerged from the Henan seafood market in Wuhan, but let me just focus on 3 points: epidemiology, molecular forensics, and genetics. First, the epidemiology. The early cases from December 2019, before the disease was even described, all centered around, in fact, they painted a bullseye on the Henan seafood market. The molecular forensics. Environmental samples were collected from the market after it was closed. The hotspot of SARS-CoV-2 positivity, the RNA, was in the southwest corner of the market. In those very same samples, RNA and DNA from raccoon dogs and mass palm civets was found in these samples, commingling with the SARS-CoV-2 RNA. Genetics. The SARS-CoV-2 spilled over at least twice in the market. The phylogenetics, the genetics of the virus are very clear about that. That is not compatible with a lab leak.
Dr. Gary, do we know that the virus that caused COVID-19 existed in the Wuhan lab before the pandemic? And if not, how could we find that out?
In fact, we don't know. The intelligence community has looked at that point very intently and has not been able to determine that Wuhan had the virus. We don't have the evidence from the Chinese. It's just one of the many things that we're missing that we would like to get from the Chinese government.
Based on the bat coronavirus that we know that researchers in the Wuhan lab are working on, would it have been possible for them to create this virus? Is it possible?
Not from a bat coronavirus. If you take the time to read my written testimony, I'm going to, in that document, I went through a lot of evidence that this virus did not spill over directly from a bat to a human being. It had to go through an intermediate animal. And it's not just the evidence from the Henan market. There's other genetic evidence. The bat coronaviruses are viruses that are spread by the gastrointestinal route. For a virus like this to become a respiratory virus is just going to require too many mutations, too many changes for a bat virus to spill directly over to a human being. That could only really happen in nature with replication through an intermediate animal.
Very good. Dr. Kobletz, the next question's for you. I'm aware that through FOIA request, a lot of information from U.S. agencies and U.S.-based organizations have been obtained by people investigating the COVID-19 origins. However, it seems as though we've gotten relatively little or nothing from Chinese agencies or the Wuhan Institute of Virology specifically. So my question for you, sir, is what specific information from China would be most helpful in settling this origin debate?
Thank you, Senator. There's a range of information that would be useful for furthering our investigation of the origins of the pandemic. The Chinese government has collected lots of information about the samples that were both at Hunan Market and elsewhere in Wuhan and in other provinces where they sampled animals, but they haven't released the raw data. They've provided information, but not the data that epidemiologists, virologists have wanted to see in order to do their own analyses. Just last year, they did release more information through publications, but this is information they've been sitting on for quite a while. So there is more information that should be released and should be made the raw data available to independent outside experts to make their own assessments. In terms of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, there should be records about the research they're conducting. There should be records about the medical surveillance they're performing on their researchers, records on the maintenance operation of their biocontainment equipment, and all that, those documentations would be, could be reviewed by outside experts to determine if there's any signs that there was any accidents or any indications that there was, the virus was, made an escape from the lab. So there's quite a bit of information that's available, but obviously the Chinese government has chosen to be opaque about what they have and what they know in a way that has frustrated people involved with looking at this in terms of assessing both the natural zoonotic spillover pathway and also looking at the lab accident pathway.
Dr. Gary, you talked about the virus jumping from an animal into a human, and we've heard the term spillover. For the benefit of this committee, could you explain spillover?
Human diseases have come to us from animals. When we're talking about a spillover, we're talking about a cross-species transmission from one animal species to another. I mean, it could be another animal, but usually when we talk about spillover, we're talking about from an animal to a human. So animals have their own viruses, just like we do. The ones that are dangerous in the animals, though, are the ones that have the capacity to infect more than one species. You can think about a virus like rabies that can infect a wide range of mammalian hosts.
So do we know what animal or animals could have carried this virus, and were they at the market? Explain that more fully, please.
Sure. We don't know that for sure. What we do know is that when you look for the virus in the market on environmental surfaces and various places, you found it mostly in the southwest corner of the market. This is where the wildlife was sold. The animals like the raccoon dogs or the mass palm civets. And in fact, many of the samples there had SARS-CoV-2 and DNA and RNA from those animals right there in the same sample. You could imagine somebody maybe came and sneezed on that sample, but the most likely explanation is that animals were in fact infected themselves with SARS-CoV-2. When you look at the drains outside of that one stall that had the most SARS-CoV-2, that drain also had virus. So it's we don't have the smoking gun evidence that there was actually an infected animal in the market, but I think we have the next best thing with this forensic molecular biology.
Very good, thank you. Ranking Member Paul, you're recognized for your questions.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit statements for the record from U.S. Right to Know, Open the Books, America First Legal, Frontiers of Freedom, and Dr. Alina Chan.
Without objection.
So just in the last few minutes, Dr. Gary has told us that this couldn't have come from bats. It had to go through an intermediate host. That may well be true, but arguing against that is they tested 90,000 some odd animals, and there is no animal host that's been found. But what he also doesn't tell you is the animal host could be a laboratory animal. It could be passed serially through that, and that's one way of quickly adapting and pushing natural selection to adapt a virus towards humans. Dr. Alina Chan has written extensively about this, how this virus didn't show up clunky and poorly transmissible. This virus showed up immediately very transmissible in humans as if it had been pre-adapted in a lab. Dr. Ebright, Dr. Gary tells us that he's wedded to the scientific method and that he considered all the different possibilities in proximal origins. And I know you're a professor, and I'm assuming you've been the senior author on many papers. I assume that you teach your younger researchers what is good scientific method and not good scientific method. In the abstract of proximal origins, Dr. Gary and his fellow authors state categorically that the virus is not a laboratory construct. That doesn't sound to me like open-mindedness, and I wonder what you would tell a younger researcher or someone you were instructing in the scientific method about putting categorical statements into a scientific paper.
Well, it's important to emphasize that the paper in question, Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, published in March 2020, was not a research article. It was an opinion piece. It was published as a commentary, which is the section in the journal that holds opinion pieces and editorials. So it was an opinion piece. The authors were stating their opinion, but that opinion was not well-founded. In March of 2020, there was no basis to state that as a conclusion, as opposed to simply being a hypothesis. Moreover, we know that compelling evidence has been presented as a result of congressional inquiry in the House that 4 of the authors of that paper, Dr. Anderson, Dr. Gary, Dr. Holmes, and Dr. Rambeau, in their private communications, show clearly that they knew the article was invalid. So in terms of what I would tell a younger scientist I would be mentoring, I would tell a younger scientist that you do not state a conclusion without evidence, even in an opinion piece in a scientific journal. And you never, under any circumstances in a scientific journal, state conclusions that you know to be unsound. That represents scientific misconduct. It represents scientific misconduct up to and including fraud. And the paper in question, the proximal origin paper, has been recommended for review of retraction. 2 requests, one in 2023 and one in 2024, were submitted by teams of scientists to the journal in question, to the journal editors, asking them to add an editorial expression of concern and to initiate a review for retraction of the article.
I know of no other example in modern scientific history or publications where a publication has come forward pronouncing with such authority that the lab leak is implausible, it is not a laboratory construct, while privately saying, this is no friggin' conspiracy theory, it looks like it did, I'm 90-10, I'm 50-50. But no doubt in the paper. In fact, we know that it went back and forth with Dr. Fauci and with editors who say, we want the statements to be stronger. We want the conclusions to be stronger. That was actually coming from Nature at the time. We want you to doctor it up and even be more strong because we're making a political point here. That's where we should have known we were off track, that these people were politicians and that they were pushing an idea because, as Dr. Collins finally admitted in one of the emails, this is about the business of science with China. This will disturb our relations with China if anybody questions this. Dr. Quay, the idea that this came from the fish market, I thought had been discredited by virtually all of the scientists. Now, I'm really surprised it's still being presented here. I know that the Chinese, the CDC, George Gao over there, basically said that they no longer consider it. And actually, if you think about it from their perspective, we're not sure if we can trust them. But at the same time, the Chinese, if they would rather have it come from a lab or the market, I think would choose the market over the lab. If anything, they would be, if we were going to think they were dishonest, would be dishonest towards saying, hey, we found some animals. But if you could review stepwise, just a little bit slower, some of the evidence for why it's not there, the amount of animals tested, the animal handlers compared to SARS-1, but also the idea of this genetic diversity that, you know, when SARS-1 came about the first time, I think it tried hundreds of times because these animal viruses don't infect humans well in the beginning. It tried 100 times over and over again. And even in the end, SARS-1 didn't transmit between humans very well. That's why containment worked. And that's why quarantine worked, because it wasn't very infectious. But go through a little bit, step by step, the evidence of why anybody still maintaining that it came from the market is misguided.
Sure. I mean, let me agree with Dr. Gary about SARS-1 being a spillover, and let me elaborate a little bit. There were 11 cities, 11 markets, 3 different lineages, and a 30 nucleotide difference among the initial cases and patients, which approximates about a year of posterior diversity, as it's called. SARS-2, of course, it's either in one market or it's in no markets. There's no other proposal for a market origin from it. 457 animals were tested in the market. 0 were found to be infected. SARS-1, 92 animals, 100% infected. The vendors, the wildlife vendors in SARS-1 were all infected. We have 10 vendors here. None of them are infected. One vendor had bamboo rats from southern China, where the backbone comes from. He was wasn't infected, his animals weren't infected. SARS-2 has no posterior diversity. So it really, as Dr. Anderson said, it's one jump from one animal to one human. The most likely place that happens is in a laboratory. And again, to be clear, when you say an animal, it could be a petri dish. It could be animal cells in a petri dish. The question of where the origins came from is the question of where the animal is. And they've tested 96 animals in nature, and they've tested 0 animals at Wuhan Institute of Virology. That's where we need to look.
Thank you. I'll reserve the rest for a second round.
Senator Hassan, you're recognized for your questions.
Well, thanks, Chair Peters and Ranking Member Paul, for holding this hearing. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. Dr. Koblenz, one of the areas of inquiry in this hearing is obviously whether research funded by the United States government has appropriate oversight. However, private companies, universities, and independent research institutions are also engaging in cutting-edge research. While their research has the potential to cure disease, unless they accept federal funding, there is very little federal oversight to ensure that private labs are in place for research facilities that don't receive government funding. And are there oversight measures that either government or independent authorities should put in place to monitor work at these labs, including labs working on gene synthesis?
Thank you. Oversight of privately funded research is much less than that of federally funded research in terms of both biosafety, biosecurity, and dual use research oversight. What we've seen in the area of dual-use research oversight, for example, in the most recent policy that the Biden administration released, only applies to federally funded research. However, there is the ability for federal agencies to require their grant recipients to apply this new policy to all research, including that's privately funded, but that requires special authority that some agencies may have, but others would need legislation to give them that ability. That wouldn't cover research that's only conducted by privately funded entities, but it would expand the scope of research that is. In order to expand the scope of oversight to all privately funded research would require legislative action. Along the lines of the proposal I included in my written statement for the establishment of a national biorisk management agency, that would have authority over biosafety, biosecurity, and dual-use research oversight, regardless of source of funding. Because at the end of the day, it shouldn't matter where the funding comes from in terms of making sure this research is being done safely, securely, and responsibly.
Thank you for that. Another question to you, Dr. Koblenz. We've heard a great deal about the risks of certain types of research involving dangerous pathogens and the need for robust oversight on the type of experiments that are performed. We've heard less about the potential risks from researchers performing off-the-books or unsupervised experiments that may be risky or unethical. How serious are the risks posed by malicious or unethical insiders, and are the United States and international authorities equipped to sufficiently mitigate these risks?
Following the revelations that Bruce Ivins was responsible for the anthrax letter attacks, which happened in 2009, the United States took a much stronger stance on trying to prevent insider threats at facilities. And so the Federal Select Agent Program, which focused on biosecurity, included a number of measures to try and better monitor science who have access to pathogens in terms of ensuring that they remain, they do not become security risks. Right. That kind of efforts to mitigate insider threats does not exist in the side of the dual-use research oversight. There is a lot of emphasis on self-governance by research institutions and by PIs to basically govern their own labs and make sure that work is not being done that is, as you said, off the books or is any way unethical. But so it is really at this point on the onus is on research institutions to make sure that the work activity being done on their facilities is in compliance with all relevant laws and regulations. So that is an area that is currently a gap in our oversight of this kind of research.
Okay, thank you. One more question for you. When it comes to biosecurity, the U.S. domestic security is obviously tied to international efforts. What happens halfway across the globe can clearly impact us in the United States. Doctor, you're involved in the Global Biolabs Initiative, which is an organization that tracks all the highest biosecurity level labs in the world. Are there labs that are of particular concern? And if so, what action should Congress and the executive branch take to improve their safety and thus our national security?
As we documented in our report last year on global biolabs, there's been a building boom in BSL-4 labs since the start of the pandemic. And so there are a number of countries that are now building their first BSL-4 labs that don't actually have their national biosafety and biosecurity legislation regulations in place. And so countries like the Philippines, Kazakhstan, Saudi Arabia are trying to construct facilities, but they don't yet have the regulatory infrastructure that they need to make sure those labs can be operated safely, securely, and responsibly. In addition, countries like China and India, who already operate BSL-4 labs, are planning on building additional labs as well. And so in all of these cases, there's a need for making sure that these, at the national level, that the right virus management policies are in place, and then at the laboratory level, that these policies are being followed properly. And there are a number of measures that both the U.S. and internationally through WHO and other entities could take to try and ensure that these regulations are in place and are being followed properly.
And can you elaborate on what those steps would be?
Sure. So there is a international standard for biorisk management that creates a framework for how do you ensure that safety and security is prioritized across your laboratory and your research enterprise. It's called ISO 35001. It was negotiated end of 2019, but has not been widely adopted yet by labs around the world. Having that kind of international standard is very useful because it provides the best practices for biosafety and biosecurity, and it includes a process by which you need to document how you're complying with that standard. That documentation then becomes available for audit in the event that you need to have any kind of investigation by local, national, international authorities to ensure that the facility is operating properly and is operating safely and securely. So that kind of standard provides an international metric for measuring whether or not a lab is operating to the international standards that we would hope they would be.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Johnson, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the ranking member for holding this very important hearing. We need a lot more of these. I want to thank all the witnesses for your very detailed testimony. And I'd encourage anybody viewing this hearing to go online and read the detailed testimony. I think you'll find it very difficult to not come away after reading that we may not have a smoking gun, but the circumstantial evidence is strong that this was a man-made virus and that it was probably leaked from a lab, probably at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. One thing that's convinced me very early on, I've been convinced this quite some time, is just the cover-up. I mean, the fact the Chinese took down data sets. So all of a sudden you couldn't find a smoking gun because it no longer exists, and we'll probably never know that. But also the cover-up here within the U.S. government. I've been doing oversight on our response to COVID, which, by the way, was a miserable failure. We're 4% of the world's population. We apparently experienced 16% of the deaths. We're supposedly the most modern medical system in the world. That's a miserable failure. And so we need to do a lot of oversight, not just on the origin, which is an important aspect of this, but on everything, okay? If we're serious about this, by the way, we got to start letting subpoenas start flying. I'll do this one more time. I've done this multiple times. This is the 50 final pages of Fauci's emails. By the way, the only reason we realize that Fauci was engaged in a cover-up with Dr. Gary is the fact that we had to FOIA these. They didn't turn these over, which they should have. We had to FOIA them. We had to go to court. Our staff has taken the 4,000 pages that we got that were redacted, narrowed those down to 400 pages, and they allowed us to look at these things unredacted in a reading room. 350 pages, but not the final 50. In terms of the cover-up, my guess is the smoking gun exists somewhere under these heavy redactions. So my suggestion, actually my plea to the chairman, is to issue a subpoena to get these final 50 pages. Then maybe we'll get a full extent of the extensive cover-up. Dr. Gary, I don't know, have you ever used the word conspiracy theory as it relates to the lab leak? Have you ever accused people who put that thing forward, they're a bunch of conspiracy theorists?
Not in my public.
Okay, well, I'll tell you who has, is the chief editor-in-chief of Nature magazine that published the proximal origin. He said, talking about your study, your cover-up, great work. We'll put conspiracy theories about the origin of SARS-CoV-2 to rest. Just admit that people who are raising the possibility of were not conspiracy theorists, that they were legitimate concern about.
Of course, sir. I mean, that would include us at the very beginning.
That's progress. That's progress because, again, an awful lot of people's reputations were ruined by this cover-up and by the accusations of people being conspiracy theorists. Dr. Ebright, the purpose of this hearing really is to talk about the danger of gain-of-function research. Right now we're about ready to be scaremongered. I think we're already being scaremongered on H5N1. Back in late 2011, the world learned of two scientific teams, one in University of Wisconsin-Madison, one in the Netherlands, that had apparently said each of these labs created H5N1 viruses that had gained the ability to spread through the air between ferrets. The animal model used to study how flu viruses might behave in humans. That's pretty darn dangerous stuff, right? That is primarily what led to the moratorium on gain of function, correct?
That is correct.
What possible reason is there to be producing what nature probably couldn't produce? Why are we doing this?
It's important to emphasize that the research in question has zero civilian practical applications. Gain-of-function research on potential pandemic pathogens is not used and does not contribute to the development of vaccines and is not used and does not contribute to the development of drugs.
So again, that rationale for all this research is exactly that. In case we have to respond, but that's the rationale. In case we have to respond to a bioweapon attack, okay, $1 million or funded EcoHealth Alliance for $42 million and USAID for $53 million, correct?
So the current definition is research that is reasonably anticipated to increase either the transmissibility or the virulence of a potential pandemic pathogen. That research does not contribute to developing countermeasures against potential pandemic pathogens.
That's the rationale they used. The thing they really scared the public on was the 1918 flu pandemic, correct? Even Anthony Fauci has admitted most people who died of the flu pandemic died of pneumonia because we didn't have antibiotics, correct?
Bacterial pneumonia.
I think one of the things we have to provide oversight, widely available, cheap and safe generic drugs. We didn't do that. I mean, from my standpoint, the first thing in any kind of pandemic is there some way to treat this? And let doctors be doctors, let them practice medicine. Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of Miller's ratchet, correct?
Of what?
Miller's ratchet. Okay, well, it's basically what viruses generally do is they'll become more transmissible but less pathogenic. Okay, because again, it doesn't do, a virus snuffs itself out. MERS snuffed itself out. SARS snuffed itself out, except there were a couple lab leaks that produced SARS outbreaks, correct? So again, my point is, are we making things worse with human intervention? Producing vaccines that are not sterilizing, that allow variants to be produced and things like antibody-dependent enhancement. Again, there's an awful lot of concern that we don't even consider here because we're on this quest to have a vaccine for everything and produce vaccines for viruses that haven't even been created yet in a lab. Again, that's the question we ought to be asking this committee is, what in the world are we doing? What's the rationale for doing this? And are we actually causing more harm than good?
With vaccine development, I would disagree. The vaccines in general do not pose significant harms and offer significant benefits. With respect to the gain-of-function research, which creates new threats, biological threats that do not exist currently and might not naturally come into existence in a decade, a century, or a millennium, that research creates threats. And those threats are existentially risky threats. And that research is being conducted without a justifiable rationale. There is no rationale in terms of development of countermeasures. Industry develops vaccines and therapeutics against diseases currently in humans, not against diseases that don't yet exist and need to be made in a lab.
We could use a public debate regarding all things vaccine, the profit motive of it and everything else, but that's for another day.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Senator Marshall, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think first of all, it's important to remember why we're here today. We're here today because we don't want to have another pandemic like this. I think it's important that we recognize that 1 million Americans have lost a loved one, and they're still looking for closure. We have 15 million Americans with long COVID. And perhaps if we knew the origin of COVID and the development, maybe that would give us a clue how to treat us. I want to start with Dr. Quay and go back to the diffuse grant for just a second. This is a grant by EcoHealth and Peter Daszak. Recall that Peter Daszak is David Moran's BFF. And that grant was denied, but yet it lays out a framework for the development of COVID-19. And you went through 6 or 7 several reasons that are absolutely consistent, that they said they would do X and they did X. And what are the chances of all those things ending up in a COVID virus?
Yeah, well, again, just as a reminder, so they said they were going to go to a particular spot in southern China to get a virus. They were going to make sure that it had diversity from SARS-1 of about 25%. They were going to put it into humanized mice to enhance its ability to recognize the receptor binding domain. They're going to put furin cleavage site in a very particular spot. You know, out of 13,000 letters in the spike protein, they said in the grant they were going to put it at a spot called the S1, S2 junction. They said, and so all of those were found in SARS-CoV-2. Its nearest neighbor is from the same area. It has a 99% binding affinity for the human receptor. SARS-1 jumped into humans. It only had 15% of the epidemic changes it needed to become epidemic.
What do you think the chances of all 6 or 7?
I've quantified it because I like statistics, and it's 1 in 1.2 billion.
So a 1 in a billion chance all that comes to fruition. There were some comments on that grant in the margin. So Dr. Barrick, North Carolina, developed the technology for the protein spike. He taught Dr. Shi. He gave them humanized mice. Again, this was all funded with USAID grant money as well. What were some of the comments in the margin you think that are significant?
Well, this is important because the folks told DARPA, we're going to do this research in North Carolina under very high safety conditions in the grant. That's what they wrote. The marginal comments in drafts that were only obtained through FOIAs said a different thing. Daszak said, hey, we're gonna shift this over to Wuhan because it'll be cheaper, faster. We'll get a lot more done that way. Barrick says, boy, if U.S. scientists knew this was going on, they would think this is crazy. This is in the marginal comments. So they, in a way, they weren't truthful with DARPA in the grant.
So Dr. Barrick, who, along with Dr. Fauci, are the father of gain of function, knew that other scientists in America would have a fit if this was being done here.
Yeah, and again,